Rain, rain, and more rain in Texas, a warm-up in the Great Lakes region, and more bad weather heading for the northwestern U.S. There's our mid-afternoon surface analysis showing all that rain in Texas and even some snow back in the Trans-Pecos and Davis Mountains. Temperatures, however, are fairly mild, mostly above freezing even in that snow area. And further out to the east, rain, low ceilings, and fog, and even a few thunderstorms down along the South Texas coast. Also some rain with another wave along that polar front in Georgia and Florida, and some rather warm temperatures in Florida. Vero Beach expecting to break its record with 87 degrees, and that breaks the record of 86. Further up north, a stagnating polar air mass across the central U.S., and further north, downslope conditions, helping to produce a rapid warm-up in western Nebraska up to the 60s, and some of that warmth making it all the way to Minneapolis, Des Moines, and even Chicago with 50 degrees this afternoon. And that's helping to burn off some of those snows that we had last week. Buffalo there up to 45 degrees. And we still have a plateau high in place across Idaho and Salt Lake City, but it is moderating. Further up north, another Pacific Northwest system producing rain and fog in the valleys and around Seattle. And this next system will be heading their way over the next few days, and then we're going to see a polar outbreak into the central U.S. once again. In Alaska, some snow north of that Gulf of Alaska system. Temperatures are rather mild for this time of year, and once again, the cold air is found mostly in the Canadian high Arctic. Not seeing those minus 20s that we had last week, but it is nevertheless quite cold, and we will be seeing more polar air generation in this region over the next week to 2 weeks. And then going back down south, westerlies, which is always a warm wind this time of year in Canada, and that's probably about all there is to look at. So let's take a look at the upper air charts. Here's a look at the current 300 millibar chart. Of course, we use actual forecaster graphics using AWIPS here. We don't use dumbed down graphics. These are actually what you would use if you were working in a forecast office. And what we see here is a long zonal flow from the Pacific, broken up into a series of troughs and also some ridges. Of course, downstream from the ridges, fair weather and sometimes mild conditions. And separated from that polar front jet are a couple of cutoff lows, one out in the Pacific near Hawaii and the other in Texas, and that's producing some of the rain and snow in the higher elevations. Now, one big change, I'll just go ahead and cheat and show you what's coming over the next couple of weeks. Take a look up north. The Hudson Bay vortex. We don't really have one right now. We've got the polar vortex up north, but just one small lobe across Baffin Island. I'm just going to play the next 10 days or so, and you can watch this whole thing evolve. So we see the polar vortex shifting down into Canada and the establishment of a deep polar vortex across western Hudson Bay. So that's how it looks on December 5th. So that's definitely a different pattern from what we have right now. And I would probably characterize that as a P&A pattern because we do have the higher heights in the Gulf of Alaska, the lower heights in the Aleutians, and high heights in Florida. However, a pretty strong band of zonal flow out in the Central Pacific, and that could very well undercut that ridge. And we'll go ahead and take a look at the surface patterns. This is the sea level pressure, the 1,000 through 700 millibar thickness, and the precipitation. Precipitation is going to be that green, and it's orange where it's heavier. And of course, we're looking at Alaska, Canada, and the U.S. You don't find sectors like this on the internet websites very much, but I think this is very valuable this time of year because most of our weather, of course, comes from Alaska, comes from the Pacific, comes from northern Canada, Why don't we have more maps like this on the internet? It's one of those things I wonder about. But what we see here is the Pacific is open. This is a positive EPO pattern advecting moisture, warmth right there into the Western Canadian region. And if we take a pen to this, we can see there's a warm front right there, probably connected back into this system here, low right there. And basically, British Columbia, Alaska, that's being battered by precipitation, and that's going to have an influence over the weekend into next week. Because when you deposit fresh snow into those valleys and interior regions, that really helps with radiational cooling. So as we go forward into Sunday, Monday, we see the pressures come up quite a bit. Alaska, Yukon, British Columbia, and the development of a new polar outbreak. That's it, coming south into Alberta, into British Columbia. And if there's any doubt of that, you just look at the pressure gradient from north to south, low pressure to the south, high pressure to the north, and that's going to drive that air southward. So cold air coming into the interior regions, into Vancouver, into the Pacific Northwest around Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And some of that, of course, will work into the Great Plains. You can see that coming into the Dakotas Monday night. So we have a 1048 millibar high developing, pressure still coming up in Yukon. And we're topping out at about 1049 millibars Tuesday night. And that's going to help reinforce some of that cold air that's still working southward. However, since we don't have that true PNA pattern, remember it was kind of being undercut a little bit on those upper air charts, that's going to probably keep a little bit of a storm track going to the south. So even though we're developing polar air up to the north, it really doesn't push south very much. You can see the leading edge right there in Wyoming. Let me pan south and you kind of see that right there. We're off the chart, but that's it. It's not racing south. It's not barreling south, just kind of oozing through the Continental Divide and into the western valleys. So by the time we get to the end of the chart, some of it's coming into the plains, but already getting that lee side troughing right here, slowing it down, and storm track still coming in from the west. So that's how things look over the next 10 days. That's most of the important weather, and the details are down in the lower 48 on those charts. So let's move to the lower 48 and look at the exact same charts going forward. You can follow along in the lower right. This shows you the valid time and date in UTC. So what do we see here? Well, we've got the downslope warming. All of this you saw in the opening analysis, and there's our plateau high in the Rockies. So moving forward, not much change through Saturday, but around Sunday, things start going downhill in the Pacific Northwest. There's the next system. Let me put on a few more. There you go. I'll increase that thickness density a little bit, and that reveals that Pacific system moving through Seattle. This is going to be Sunday morning, and with that, quite a bit of rain. And, of course, I forgot Texas. Of course, in Texas right now, we have that cutoff low with the jet stream running around the south and eastern side, and eventually that will open up and lift to the northeast, and basically that happens overnight into tomorrow. There it goes. Pretty good dose of rain through Houston and Fort Worth overnight, and then that moves up into Arkansas and the Mississippi River Valley tomorrow night. So that'll continue to move pretty quickly to the northeast, and then we focus our attention back to the northwestern region. Low pressure around Seattle. Some cold air starting to come down through the central plains, but that's not a particularly large shot of polar air. Let's watch that come south. There it is, sweeping into the Dakotas on early Tuesday. That's the leading edge of that Canadian air. The bulk of the Arctic air still developing up to the northwest. So by Wednesday, shallow polar air moving into the southern and central plains, and the Arctic air, you're going to see that start nosing in right there into British Columbia. And with that, the heights really come up in that area, and probably some gap winds into Vancouver and Seattle as that comes south. But it's not going to move south very fast, as I mentioned. The storm track coming off the Pacific, kind of a zonal flow, and that will help enhance some of the pressure falls in the western U.S., and that tends to block the movement of Arctic air southward. So by the time we get up to Friday, December 2nd, that's about a week from now, some Arctic air trying to move south, but not making much progress. It mostly goes off to the east there, and the rest of it gets hung up there in the plateau regions and west of the divide. But 1034 millibars there, that's a good chunk of cold air. And also with that southern stream system, looks like another cutoff low in California and some unsettled weather in the southern Rockies. And now we're starting to get out into fantasy land. We're not going to worry too much about the forecast at this point, but I think we will have a lot to look at going into December. Let's return to the current conditions. We do have that polar low off of South Texas, warm front like that. And of course, remember the stacking. These frontal lows stack towards the cold air with height, and that's where we pick up that upper level low. And under those upper level lows, you tend to have steep lapse rates. If you have any moisture down at the surface, that interacts with that steep lapse rate and produces convective precipitation. You can see the heavy snow there at Fort Stockton as we record this. We got snow from Fort Stockton back to Pecos, all the way up towards Carlsbad. Not up to Roswell, that's off the screen there, but it does come down to Van Horn. Marfa, Presidio, still liquid drizzle. And that's about the extent of the snow. None of it to the east, because we've got plenty of warm air out there, 40s and upper 30s. A few travel problems out there as we record this, mostly between Fort Stockton and Saragossa. But let's see if we can bring up a traffic camera. Yeah, there you go. Looks pretty slushy there. Snow looks a little bit denser near the I-20, I-10 split. There's Interstate 20 near Toya. And there is Pecos. Moving further east towards Midland, Odessa, it gradually changes over to rain. And you can see it's a very compact system. Definitely some convective elements right there around the Davis Mountains and Trans-Pecos, as we mentioned, but plenty of clearing around the periphery. Albuquerque, clear skies, and partly cloudy around Deming and El Paso. And it's good to be familiar with how this looks on infrared imagery. It kind of breaks out into two different systems, and we're indeed seeing the upper level low right there spinning, and the main Bear Clinic region, the Bear Clinic Leaf, the warm conveyor belt off to the east, and in between a gap, and that represents a dry slot right there in between. And that's how it looks on the water vapor imagery. Really breaks things out into two different systems. The dry slot, mid-level, and upper-level dry air really shows up. In fact, let's drop a sounding right there. And there you go. Plenty of dry air up above 15,000 feet. Also some dry air right around 10,000 feet. Just a little bit of mid-level cloud, but most of the moisture that we're seeing, the stratocumulus and stratus, way down at the bottom part of that sounding. And that's all for this edition of Forecast Lab. Just as a reminder, you've probably noticed we don't run ads on YouTube. If you're seeing them, YouTube's putting them in. I don't know about it. If you're seeing them, maybe mention that in the comments. But we get zero ad revenue here. Everything's done on Patreon, and that's why I ask for your support. And we'll see you back here on Monday for the supporters. Thanks to all of you who are supporting the program, and for everybody else, we'll be back here on Wednesday. Have a good one. Bye-bye.